Firstly, on the future political system of Bangladesh. Secondly, on stability and why the BNP would be bad for it, as well as incredibly bad governance. Let's start with the future political system of Bangladesh, because we think the biggest football in this debate isn't about who wins government the next time, because what's happening at the moment is we have an interim government, and before we go to another general election, they're going to have an election before that to form a special assembly to rewrite the Bangladeshi constitution and reform the government institutions of that country. And the most important thing in this debate is who has power in that to form the long-term constitution of Bangladesh, what the formation of government is going to look like. And that very intuitively outweighs the rest of the debate. So they're talking about all of the governance structures that inform every single election into the future. What are the problems with Bangladesh's political system at the moment? First of all, the massive rigging of elections. What was supposed to happen is that the government, prior to an election, would give up power to a caretaker government such that they weren't in power during that election so that they couldn't rig it. The Awami League refused to do that, and that's why the BNP boycotted almost every election in the last decade. So, secondly, there's an enormous amount of corruption in Bangladeshi government. That's to say, there's an enormous amount of embezzlement, an enormous amount of people who are appointed bureaucrats who continue to preserve their own ends. There's also an enormous amount of judicial problems. Members of the judiciary essentially act in line with political parties. All of them were forced to mass resign and protest because they were trying to bring back Sheikh Hasina after she had fled to India. There's an enormous amount of problems that need to be solved in this constitutional assembly, and currently the interim government has established a large number of commissions under Mohammed Hassan and also with the involvement of the student leaders to reform these problems. Why is it?
Yunus has a no price. Do you think that the international actors are likely to want to negotiate with him or a university student?
Hassan isn't going to run in the next election, to be clear. He's coming a caretaker, which is what he did in the last caretaker election about 20 years ago. But he's very explicitly a caretaker. He's not here to be a long-term political actor in Bangladesh. So, why is it that it is necessary to have these people involved in the Constitutional Assembly? First of all, the existing forces in politics benefited from each of these systems. All of their allies, they were put in place by the existing political system, so they're incredibly unlikely to want to change it. But secondly, without a specifically large institutional force against this, it's likely that any smaller forces that OG talks about, like individuals or small groups of 2 or 3 running, would be able to get this change through. They're likely to be bought off or horse traded by the larger parties. They're less likely to have an agreement on what this reform should look like, so even if they all agree there should be reform, if they don't agree on it, that one net's going to get outvoted. And also, they weren't involved in the creation of it. The student leaders got Mohammed Hassan in, that served in roles with those commissions developing it, so they are the ones who's involved in the development and can get it passed through. Why is it that they can only get this done if they are a party? First of all, being a part of a party is necessary for branding and selling your candidates. And secondly, like elections are big business. You need operatives, you need money, you need ads, you need institutional capacity. You can't do this as a set of 2 or 3 individuals. The next thing I want to prove is that other institutional power in Bangladesh is very, very rare. Because they keep on wanting to other institutions we might support. But there's good, and I asked them to name one, which they can't, but there's good structural reasons to believe there aren't a lot of other large institutions in Bangladesh that could form themselves into political parties. First of all, it was an authoritarian country. Secondly, the Awami, which meant that obviously they were trying to shut down any alternative institutional power base. Secondly, the Awami League tried to position itself as a big tent party that could include anyone in, so they had an incentive to try and bring in any other institutions and align themselves with the Awami League. And thirdly, Bangladesh has been in chaos for many years. The initial protests against the quota system started in 2018, and in that context of chaos, it's very difficult to form institutional power. So that means that there aren't a lot of other large institutions that could step into this gap. The best comparative then is BNP or other smaller parties. Opening government says, well, students are seen as bad, they're seen as irrational, they're seen as too young. But the problem with this is that this party isn't just going to run students. They're going to bring other people in. For instance, they brought in Hassan in the short run. Also, they brought in a large number of university professors who actually designed the original system of reform. They worked with their own professors. And military leaders, as opening opposition points out, military leaders who told the military to put down their arms, not to oppose this. And those people have almost nothing in common, except for the fact that they were brought together by anti-discrimination students movement. That is why they're likely to be taken seriously. And that also rebuts closing government, who's like, well, they're incredibly terrible, but they brought in a large amount of support. The key thing is that they are important for bringing those people together. I also want to note here, not only is it important that they're part of the Constitutional Assembly to solve all those problems, but it's also important that they are the first government afterwards. Because as I alluded to, the entire Supreme Court of Bangladesh was forced to resign because they were seen as trying to bring back Sheikh Hasina. That means that they're going to get to appoint the next set of justices who will make the first interpretations of the new constitution that will serve as the baseline precedent against which that constitution is interpreted, and that's incredibly important. They also set the norms of how it's interpreted, and if another party wins, they have an incentive to show that the new rules that they don't like are very bad and very difficult in order to manufacture consent to get them taken away. It's very important that they are not only involved in the writing of it, but that they are the first party to interpret it and to appoint the justices who do so. What are the benefits of this? It means that you get a government that functions, which is important for your economics. It also means you get rid of the quota system, right? Which is not only unmeritocratic, but also incredibly bad for the functioning of government because you appoint a large number of freedom fighters to the system not because they're good. And it makes, and crucially, it makes the Bangladeshi public service not politically neutral because the freedom fighters that are appointed have political allegiances, and it means that you don't have a neutral public service. That pretty much weighs pretty intuitively over the rest of the debate. Second extension. Why is it that you get more stability? Opening government says you will get the military coup. Opening opposition pretty astutely points out that the military explicitly allow them to come through. You're very unlikely to get a military coup. Why is it that the BNP would be incredibly bad for stability? First of all, their leader is not clear he can legitimately run. He's in charge of anti-corruption, and different courts are split over his actual legitimacy as a candidate. So that means that there's incredibly likely to be protests. Secondly, there's very likely to be Hindu protests when this aggressively pro-Muslim party wins, who's done terrible things to Hindu minorities in the past. And thirdly, your relationship with India is likely to be substantially worse, and they're likely to foment unrest on the ground. We already saw Indian forces in the country protecting Sheikh Hasina on her side during the last revolution, and they have an incentive to foment chaos in the country in order to re-establish their influence. And I know these aren't only reasons why you don't get stability. There are also reasons why the BNP is bad. Like, they are anti-Hindu, we should care about Hindu. They are anti-India, we should care about your relationship with India, your trade relationship, your security relationship. They have done corruption, which is not only the reason you can't legitimately run, but also, corruption is bad. Additionally, I think it's important that these student leaders are there to be able to tamp down protest. Opening opposition says, well, the student leaders might do protest, but I think that's the lower impact argument, because their protests on net have been pretty good and pretty reasonable. What's more important is the bad, more aggressive sets of protests that might come from other actors, which we think they're uniquely good at tamping down and stopping becoming violent. First of all, people will feel lied to if these people don't follow through on their promises. Secondly, they are powerful figures who can come out persuasively and urge people to tamp down. But thirdly, the protesters are more willing to negotiate with them when they're in government because they have a history of being receptive to protest rather than turning to violence because they feel the government will never listen because protest will never work.